So I'm gonna make sure that everyone has the recording. And hi everyone, I'm just letting everybody into the room. If you notice that your name looks like Delora instead of your name, could you go to your video box, to your image, and click on the 3 dots and rename yourself? You can also do that if you're joining and want to add your preferred pronouns. And we'll get started in just a couple minutes. And you'll hear me repeat this a couple times before we get started. But welcome everybody. So I'm just saying welcome to everyone who's joining right now. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, and we are recording this session. You feel free to keep your video off if you don't want to have yourself recorded. We do ask that if you came into the Zoom room with the name Delora on it, if you're not Dee, our presenter, could you please go to your image of yourself, your video screen, and click the 3 dots and rename yourself. Or you can go to your name in the participant list and also rename yourself that way. And then anybody else, and you can see that in the shared screen, if you're also interested, you can share your pronouns like Dee and I have. You can see our example, and you do the same thing. You just click on those 3 dots in the top right corner of your video, of the video of yourself, or in your name in the participant list. We're just curious who's joining, because otherwise it looks like we have many, many Ds, many Deloras on the call. So I'll give it about 1 more minute and then we'll start. And you'll see in the chat that Manpreet has put a survey for you to fill out. While we're waiting for people to join, if you haven't filled out our survey yet, we'd ask that you do take a moment to do that now, or click on the link now so that you can do that after the call. It has some information for us to get to know you, and hopefully we'll get to see you again in our next dialogue next Friday. And it also, thanks to our co-host National ACE, it has some information also about how to be connected with them. Okay, I think we'll get started. So I just want to say, let's see, one more person I'm letting in. Okay, I'm going to say welcome everybody. My name is Rebecca Canara. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Executive Director of Universal Human Rights Initiative, and I'm just really excited to be here with all of you today. This has been a really special series that we started the first Friday of May, and we're continuing through next Friday as well. So I hope that you'll join us next week as well if you haven't. And for those of you who've been with us in the past 2 weeks, welcome back. Today's a special hot topic conversation. When we hold dialogues, we are always talking about the key issues around discrimination and human rights that people are facing, and we practice having difficult conversations so that we're more comfortable doing it, and all of this to lead us to taking action in our community and our lives. And so in that spirit, our board members really asked that we create a series to honor the Asian American community, celebrate the diversity within, and really talk about issues folks are facing. And so because of that, we have our amazing moderator, Dee, who is here, and she'll do some introductions shortly. And so we have Dee, and then Lina Do and Manpreet Delombrar are usually our facilitators in the rest of the series. Today, Manpreet and I will be here with you afterwards to have a dialogue after the panel conversation. And so just want to welcome you all. And again, I'm just going to say one more time, if you've joined the room and you have Delora's name instead of your own name, if you could just choose the 3 dots in the corner of your video to rename yourself, or click on your name in the participant list and just rename yourself so we know who's here. We would really appreciate that. And I'm going to hand it over to Manpreet.
Hi, everybody. I want to just welcome you as well to this space. This is going to be a really special space, and I see some familiar faces who've been joining us for the last couple of sessions. I think we're also joining at a very hard time, a really difficult time, challenging time for a lot of communities, but especially for the Black community. So I want to just ask us to just sit for a moment, and we're mourning the tragic racist shootings that occurred just this past weekend in Buffalo, New York, and also other shootings that have happened in other communities. And we're really grieving with those who lost their lives. We want to offer support to the families who lost loved ones, but also just the community as a whole. And because we're standing in solidarity against these violent acts in the name of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, I want to ask you to just make some space in your hearts and hold these victims in your heart as we offer just a brief moment of silence to get us into this space, because we're talking about issues, systemic issues, issues of racism, really hot topics today. But we need to also hold and stand in solidarity with those who lost their lives and with the African American community as a whole. So I'm going to ask you to please hold these victims in your heart and just hold a moment of silence before we begin. It took less than a minute to read these names to myself. And we just held these victims in our heart. But this is a really tragic loss that we're mourning. And before we can continue on with the conversations we're having today, we just want to hold this bigger picture in heart where we're standing against white supremacy, we're standing against discrimination in its all forms. And that's where this 4-part series really comes in that Rebecca had introduced. We've been meeting for 2 times already, and today we get to hear from our guest speakers, who Dee will introduce very shortly. But I want to just share some of the themes we've covered so far in our series, because we've covered a lot of different issues that are clearly in front of us right now on a national and a local level. We've covered intersectional issues like racism and sexism, economic inequality, hate crimes, which clearly have been on the rise for the AAPI community and for other communities of colors, as we're seeing. And we've also covered this last time internalized and socialized stereotypes of the AAPI, AANHPI, or APIDA communities from outside and from also within our own communities. And today we're going to be really getting into how we impact systemic issues and hearing from our panelists. And next time, we'll really get to talk about action. And what do we do? What can we do about all of these things that are happening in these systemic issues? So we'll get started with checking in on that today. I'm going to pass it on to Dee, who's going to be our moderator for our panelists. And I'll get to talk to you all in a little bit again. Please use the chat while we're hearing from our panelists to share your thoughts, what's on your mind, and any questions you have. Rebecca and I are going to be moderating the questions so we can get to them during the open Q&A. And thank you again so much for being here. And if you can, please change your name on Zoom, again, to add your pronouns if you wish and your preferred name, so we have an easier time identifying you. Thank you so much again for being here. Dee, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction and giving a background as far as where we've been and where we want to go. So I am Delora Aichholzer. I go by Dee. I am affiliated with 2 organizations, Women Execs on Board and also Leadership California. which really, if it wasn't for those two nonprofits, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. It is a group of women in both of these organizations, of diverse leaders coming together to really make a difference, not only in our communities, but also within the state and globally, nationwide and globally. So here's the agenda today. Really what we've already said is it is a psychological safe space for all of us to come together. We want to make sure it is a no judging zone and that we are not grouping people together based off of implicit bias. So we want to make sure that this is a very dynamic conversation that we're having with one another and that the chat is open. So many of you who came today have so much experience in dealing with the inequalities, with the lack of accountability in some of our systems. So we really want to be able to share all those best practices, your ideas, what's on your heart and what's on your mind in the chat, because we will be recording the session and we will be also archiving the chat to share with the greater community. We want to make sure that, we take basically, again, where we've been more into where we want to go collectively. So if we could turn onto that next slide. I am deeply honored to introduce the panel today. So Dr. Anita Gupta, she is part of the FDA advisory board. And, behind that is really, she's been on the front lines of the opioid and the fentanyl crisis, as well as dealing with the COVID pandemic. She does a lot of policy work with Washington, D.C., on top of being an anesthesiologist, a pharmacist, a professor, and a board member. So I'm super grateful to have her join us today. I know her through Women Execs on Boards, and so just grateful for her time and what she has on her heart to teach us today. The second panelist is Carol Chen. I met her through Leadership California. She is a partner and trial lawyer. She works with Winston and Strawn right now, and she was part of the formal DOJ, the Department of Justice, as a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office, dealing with white collar crime and, everything else to deal with equality. Knowing her through Leadership California's program, and thereafter, both Carol and Anita are both doers, executors, like many of you on the call today. And then Sarah Haque. Such a pleasure to meet Sarah. She is a policy associate. She works for National ACE, which advocates for anti-AAPI crime and for small businesses impacting the AAPI community. She is a direct conduit into Washington, D.C. She is in Washington, D.C. right now. And she's really here today to educate us about policies and what we can do collectively. So really wonderful. I am so grateful to have not just these three panelists, but also I want to give a special shout out to Debbie Manning, who I know some of you have met before, but she is also with Leadership California. She was the first Chief Sergeant of Arms. And so it's such an honor to just have her presence here, as well as everyone else in the community who is doing a lot of deep work. So if we can go to the next slide. The goals today is to act collectively for systemic change in the structures that impact racism, hate crimes, violence, and inequality. So whether it's dealing with media or social media, education, policies, or corruption, that is one objective we have today. The second is in the AAPI community and across diverse communities, we have not gotten to where we want to go in terms of social justice, with occurrences of history repeating itself in hate crimes. So really, how can we come together to get there? The objective is really to disrupt the rising trend of innocent lives being lost or unjustly impacted by sharing what's worked and what's not worked in the past based off historic learnings and context. So as we open with, the remembrance of all the mass shootings that have happened prior and the 25 that have happened this month, it takes me back to Sandy Hook. And it takes me back into something that hasn't worked for us as a community at large. I'm also reflecting on, just the homeless and the mental health crisis our nation is facing. We just allocated $1 billion here in California, or at least in Los Angeles, but this is again on top of billions and billions that have also already been spent, but we still have a rise in those types of issues. And so those are things that impact us collectively and impacts our communities collectively. So those are the types of systemic issues that we're trying to face together in this forum today. So let's see. If any of you, again, as we go into conversation with the panelist speakers, if any of you have thoughts, ideas, best practices that you want to share in the chat and or introduce yourself, what organization you're with, what work you are doing, and what we can do as a community to get ourselves there. An example would be if you come from the education space and you have contacts overseeing districts or people overseeing school districts, put into chat, what are you working on? What are you doing? How can we help? Because we want to basically have an open dialogue where we're sharing best practices and key learnings with one another. So with that said, I am going to ask the first question. Our nation has been dealing with systemic issues such as the rise of hate crimes, illegal drugs, and corruption that have impacted the funding going to mental health and veteran policies, which have complicated some of our societal issues today. Why did you choose to be involved in the work you've been doing, and what can be done on a deeper level? Dr. Anita, I would love to start with you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank you for bringing us all here together for this important time, and all the panelists and the people that have joined. I think it's an important topic that you have brought us all here for us today. And I think it's really important that we discuss it openly in a safe space. So thank you. And Carol and Sarah, I'm honored, deeply honored to be part of this panel. I think it's important that we share ideas in a collaborative, multi-stakeholder environment. And to your question, first, why did I get involved? My story began in Philadelphia, front lines as a doctor many years ago, when I saw the inequities that were happening deep in Center City with the opioid crisis, with healthcare, with populations that were underserved, and I wanted to do more. It was a fairly simple story, and I just was frustrated, as we're seeing now with COVID-19, with many of the physicians and healthcare providers. There just wasn't enough being done. And, that really drove me to find solutions. I felt that more could be done and more should be done, and that we could do more. But as time goes on, and as we can see, it's not that easy. It's not that easy to lead and to create change. There's many barriers to access, not only in healthcare, but other things, resources, food, climate change, sustainability, and even just access to basic resources. It takes time, it takes energy, and it takes investment. And throughout the journey career, I've realized that there's just a lot of challenges to lead, and particularly as a woman, and particularly as a minority. So, throughout my career, I've realized that particularly with the opioid crisis, there are challenges for patients and people to address, but I've continued to lead that action, continue to work with multi-stakeholder groups such as all of you here and others to find those solutions, because we can't give up. We have to continue to lead, and we have to continue to, take responsibility for myself, and for others. As a physician, that has been my code, and that has been one of the oaths that I have taken as a healthcare professional. And second, I think, one of the things regarding the opioid crisis, there is no solution that has really been found. The problem continues. As many of you know, the crisis is continued to rise. Fentanyl is still a situation in many of the cities throughout the United States, and every city. And children are impacted, adults are impacted, and the mental health crisis continues to escalate. So we have to continue to work on this. And I know many of you believe that the things that we're seeing right now in society have much to do with it. So I would be happy to hear the other panelists and their thoughts on perhaps the intersections of the opioid crisis and drug crisis and how it impacts their work, and some of the things that they're seeing as well.
Carol, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Yes, sure, I would love to. First of all, I echo Anita. This is such an important conversation we're having, and I'm so honored to be a part of it. So I guess first of all, Dee, if I could sort of step back a little bit and just to clarify about your question of why I got involved. So I left the DOJ last year after 15 years. I was chief of the section that prosecuted opioids cases. So Anita, I think we have a lot to talk about, but also crimes of violence. And so I loved the moment of silence at the beginning because that is a cause that is very near and dear to my heart. The section that I was chief of and that the cases that I prosecuted involved opioids, drug cases, gang cases, crimes of violence, darknet, and cryptocurrency. And so there's also a little bit of the darknet issue going on, right, with social media these days. And everything basically could be a positive or a negative, depending on how we utilize it. And so I loved hearing, Anita, about your work. I will say personally why I got involved. So now I'm at a big law firm. I never thought I would leave DOJ, but for me, and I've said this to Dee a lot, representation is everything. Including what Anita said about being a woman of color. And so I decided to continue fighting within the private sector. But these are a lot of different issues, right? Opioids, there's an opioids epidemic. I had done one of the first synthetic drug cases before it was even called an epidemic. And one of the good things is there's social awareness now, at least, right? I think that we have to take the positives where we can. And one, there are people like Anita in the fight, in the personal fight. But I think social awareness is really key. And in terms of opioids, I mean, Anita can talk about it better, but there's so many different causes for it. Why I chose to be a part of everything that I've done in my journey is probably not too uncommon for a lot of people. I come from a multi-generational immigrant family, and I saw my parents make a lot of sacrifices for me. And I was taught really, really early on that it was my duty, frankly, to try to leave this world a better place than when I entered into it. And so for me, it's all about adding value in whatever way I can. And so when Dee said, for example, we're going to have this conversation with a lot of different stakeholders about all sorts of issues in a no holds barred forum, I was like, let's go for it, right? And so I think for opioids, honestly, it's so many different causes, right? Everybody has to take responsibility. For me, life is about accountability, holding myself responsible first and foremost, and then holding other people responsible. Opioids, there's so many different causes. Obviously, pharmaceutical companies, doctors who overprescribe, right? And then ultimately some of the root causes. I don't want to be the lawyer who keeps on talking, so I'll try to sort of wrap up so that Sarah can speak. But I will say that I loved especially the beginning when you talked about solidarity, because one of the things I do want to talk about today is the need for different communities to reach out to each other. And there's actually a rich history, right? That's part of my sort of angst over the lack of a more inclusive curriculum. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there's such a rich history of actually, for example, Black Asian coalition and solidarity. And I think, you know, we will find solutions to a lot of the problems we're going to talk about today by one, not othering each other and other people. And I say this as a former prosecutor, and we can go into detail if anybody cares, but I found out that most of my defendants are not that different from me, frankly. A lot of it is about privilege, and especially about in the formative years. And I, you know, got to know some of my defendants really well. And I do think that we need to there's just a huge gap in social services and mental health, substance abuse, et cetera. So I think I might have answered 5 questions in one, but I'm super excited and jazzed by this conversation. So with that, I will stop, Dee.
You hit on so many key points, and you know, all communities have been working towards diverse education. Newsom has committed, after the rise of AAPI crimes, that there would be more diverse curriculum taught in our public school systems. You mentioned to me, Carol, that I believe Grace Meng is also working on a bill currently right now. So whether it's having more diverse education in our school systems to impact that, you know, collectively as a whole, or whether it's to have oversight in the funding that we get for, you know, mental health, if it's, you know, exacerbated by drugs, corruption from pharmaceutical companies that, you know, have to be held accountable at some point, then trickling down to stakeholders and impacting innocent lives, and you know, basically losing innocent lives from all of this. It's all somewhat related to a lack of oversight and potentially accountability. So I want to ask Sarah this question, because a lot of times there are changes in our policies. There are propositions that are written that are backed by special interests. There are stakeholders that are impacted by this. And what I see is sometimes it creates what I say, this unnecessary divide, because LA, California, we're so beautifully diverse. How can we understand on a deeper level what is behind, you know, some of the propositions or the policies we're voting for, or if things are changing, how do we stay on top of it? And how do we find ourselves aligned with politicians and their values, so that when we're going to vote, we're voting for the communities that we really care about?
Thank you, Dee, for the question. And hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And yeah, thank you to everyone who's helped organize and put this together. Just a really quick intro. My name is Sarah. I'm the Policy Associate at National ACE. We are a AAPI Chamber of Commerce. So we support small AAPI business owners. And yeah, we do a lot of policy advocacy, policy research, and a lot of programming. And one of the things that we've been involved in since as of the last 2 years has been the rise of anti-API discrimination and racism. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about these policy topics. And Dee, as to your question, I think that when we talk about laws being backed by special interests, or when you're really trying to understand you know, the origins of a law or what it actually does, oftentimes, you know, policy is written in a way, you know, I'm speaking mostly to the federal level, but this is also true for the local level. Policy is usually written in a way to be confusing. Like, it's usually designed to be confusing. And, you know, even myself, when I'm reading policies, I just am confused most of the time. And so that's not on the person at all. And I think sometimes when we have these conversations, we put the onus on the person to, you know, educate themselves, or to be diligent, or to do research. The truth is the onus should be on
the writers, the representatives, the government, the state to make those things more accessible, because the systemic part of it is that it's designed to not be accessible. And so something that I've learned is that, and everyone probably knows this, I'm relatively new to this field, so I'm really excited to learn more from all of you who've been working and, been in activism for so long. But, most laws have special interests backing them, which is something I think we all probably are familiar with. You can kind of expect that to be the norm a lot of the time. That's why a lot of things have not been done in topics that should be uncontroversial. For example, gun control, nothing has been done because of special interests and alongside other things. And one way I think these laws mask as being accessible is that they tend to throw around the word transparency. They tend to throw around the word accessibility, when actually it's not really transparent. It's not really accessible. And they do this because they know that constituents want transparency. So transparency is something that, when you're going around talking to, in our case, small business owners, when you're talking to them, something that always comes up is people want transparency. So if they're applying for a federal grant, they want to know why they were rejected, or what's going on. They want to be able to communicate with their representatives, with their government officials in their area. And transparency is really desirable. It's something that people want. And so it's become kind of something that these laws throw around to hide that they're not actually transparent. And then they give you the impression that they're doing something when they're not really. One thing that I've learned is that names can be misleading. So if a law says this law is meant to dispense funds to small business owners, if you go and read the fine print, then oftentimes what's actually happening is that they might be taking money from other programs that exist that are supposed to be helping those communities, and instead putting into this program, which doesn't actually lead to more money going towards this program, if that makes sense, or towards this community, because it's just a redirection of funds that weren't used. And when that happens, that means the money wasn't actually distributed to the community it was supposed to go to. So I think that that's something that becomes clear when you're reading the fine print, although that is hard to do because, policy is long and technical and it can be a bit dry. It's not really an exciting read. So that's why, systemically it's designed to be that way. So it's nothing to do with the individual, that's meant to be a barrier, and so that's one thing. You can try reading the law. Another thing is at the federal level, small Senate committees and House committees have public hearings most of the time. And that's something that I've been attending a lot in my new position. I attend a lot of the hearings by the Financial Services Committee in the Senate. And these hearings as well are so long. So, this is another thing. It's whereas you could make something simple, it's so long and it's meant to, just be, people just check out, right? So then it's you're not actually grasping all the information you need to grasp. But these hearings are so enlightening because you can actually be a part, you actually hear what the conversation is like. And you can see all the experts that they're bringing in, and you can then look up those experts and you can see the organizations they're coming from and what interests they represent. And yeah, I think that's kind of one thing that I found helps me. So, and then of course you can turn to nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations. Oftentimes, even if they don't know something, if someone were to come to me and say, oh, there's this policy that, I don't really know what's going on, what are the intricacies of it? Even if I don't know, I would be happy to, do research on it and to help people navigate that as best as they can. And I know that that's true of probably many nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations. And so that is definitely another thing that voters can do to learn more about what special interests are backing these laws, what's going on in terms of this law. Is this really going to do what it's saying it's going to do? yeah, it's mostly, you know, a lot of the things that I learn about laws are through word of mouth and through your community. And so I would never underplay that. I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And so just staying in community and trying to connect to your organizations and, you know, splitting up the work. Because like I said, a hearing is like 3-4 hours, and that's a lot for a person. So yeah, that's, you know, sorry if I was rambling, but I
Not
hope I
at all.
answered your
And
question. Yeah.
you certainly did, and very well spoken. So thank you for that. I'm thinking about reflecting on what you said. A lot of the community members here, it is because we've had these conversations about who will serve in our interests as a community. So whether it is having a conversation with an African American friend of mine who says, hey, predatory loans have been, they've been out there, they've been in our community, they've been exposed to, students or businesses, and then having someone like Carol say, hey, that same practice is also happening in the Asian community as well. And I think the more conversations we have about these types of topics with diverse communities, you're starting to see the patterns. And that's why we're starting to see the patterns unfold in ways that are systemic, that we want to disrupt. So going back to that second goal, I want to kind of open it up as far as what can we disrupt together so that the metrics that we have rising in the ways that we don't want to see in our society, we can really come together and problem solve. So Rebecca, please also speak up. I know not everyone knows Rebecca, but Rebecca is the executive director of UHRI, and it's the platform that we're all here today. She has been on the front lines of homelessness from San Francisco all the way down to Southern California. Her heart is of gold. She is the one who is literally helping, talking, speaking to these people or to that particular community and bringing their personal belongings and really treating them as humans, because they are really humans at the end of the day, and trying to understand what is happening from her perspective too. Why isn't the funding getting to the nonprofit organizations that are doing the work when it's so much money? So I don't know if you want to say anything to that, Rebecca.
Let me come in later because I'm busy taking notes from everyone right now, and I'll let you focus first for these panels, if that's okay. Just for my brain to handle everything.
Dee, do you mind if I just broke in so just to follow up on what both you and Sarah just talked about. So in terms of, for example, the predatory loans, right? Talking about sort of similar struggles, obviously some different struggles, but also shared sort of struggles across different communities. Predatory loans obviously is a big issue, both for the Black and the Asian communities, especially small business owners. And one of the things that I've noticed is this idea whenever you generalize about a community or make it monolithic, right, you sort of hide the differences even within the community. And so what was jarring to me, and Sarah, you may have known this already, and a lot of you in this group, is that 1 in 4, for example, AAPI in California are at or below the poverty line, the working class, right? And a lot of it is hidden by this model myth minority. And then in terms of the predatory loans, of course, we all know about how hard it is for the Black community to get the loans and also to get into the housing community. But on top of that, and then I'll shut up, is as a former prosecutor, and I left only last year, one of the things that we dealt with, Dee, I've spoken to you a lot about this, about fraud and corruption, the EDD loan fraud, as well as the PPP fraud. These are, programs that were instituted during the pandemic to help out small business owners as well as communities, and they were also hugely susceptible to fraud. So there's a lot of different issues going on, and of course we all sort of see the homelessness issue is just getting worse. You have a lot of politicians, we have a obviously a mayoral race going on, promising all sorts of solutions, but nobody's explaining how they actually can be executed practically, right? So I saw one of the questions was, how do we hold politicians accountable? And I'd be curious to see if anybody in the audience has any solutions.
That's a perfect segue. And Manpreet, is that okay with you? Because I'm looking at the time, and I think this is the perfect time to start engaging the audience. So anyone who wants to speak, feel free to unmute yourself, put on your cameras. Again, it's a psychological safe space. There's no judging here. Everyone's opinion is welcome, and everyone's experience is honored. And if not, I'm going to call on people. Just kidding.
I think maybe we stop spotlighting Manpreet and we have everybody so we can see each other. Is that okay? And I'll just carry forward for the Q&A then what I saw in the chat, which were related. I think there was definitely a response to Sarah to what you're saying. I think it really stood out around that these policies are designed to not be clear. And so there's a question of how do we hold the policymakers accountable for translating policy into more understandable language so that we reach those folks who are really directly impacted. That's a big one, as you mentioned me, and thinking about homelessness. I have another piece about that is how do you make sure that there's more people with lived experience at the table? So that's one piece on the accountability, but there's this other piece, Sarah, right, that we saw in the chat on the redistribution of funds that you talked about. Is it always a negative, or are there times when these funds are wasted by programs? Because you hear that a lot in the media, right? And are there places where you see that the funds are redirected in a positive way? So I'll put that out to the group and see who wants to respond.
So I will chime in here. So I grew up in New Jersey and right outside of Philadelphia, and as a pain doctor and someone that's deeply interested in the opioid crisis, one of the trends that's emerging and has not really been well studied is around this community, the Asian community, is around the opioid and drug crisis. And the numbers are rising. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, this category, this community is beginning to show rising numbers of overdoses. And interestingly enough, the federal government has not appropriated enough funding to study this kind of category of research. We haven't historically studied it enough. And I don't even know if there's researchers dedicated to this community. I haven't researched it myself, but I'm trying to understand if federal dollars have been earmarked to this area specifically. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is just one small area and one community that really is beginning to also be impacted by a very serious public health issue. And I know in New Jersey in itself, now also in California, they're beginning to show signals of being impacted by this crisis.
Can I briefly weigh in? And I promise, Sarah, I think you definitely should weigh in on this. Just very quickly, just speaking to what Anita said, which I thought was such a great point. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, we decided that we were going to try to figure out racial disparities in terms of prosecutions and sort of sentences that we were recommending. And one of the things that was sort of eye-opening to me was that there was no category, frankly, for defendants of AAPI descent. It was actually lumped in as an other. So I think that's part of the invisibility, sort of perpetual foreigner issue that I think you know, a lot of the communities we're talking about, but including AAPI and Native Hawaiian, you know, that we're facing. We're just not really, there's not enough research out there. The second part, though, I think is a little bit also, you know, cultural, right? A lot of it is also, there's a lot of shame in talking about mental health in terms, which drives my understanding, Anita, and I don't want to take your expertise, but my understanding is a lot of that is because of mental health issues, particularly in the younger generation in the AAPI community. When I, you know, before I left DOJ, there was a huge increase, and there still is, in crimes of violence and, you know, suicides in general because of the pandemic, sort of, you know, accentuating a lot of the issues already to vulnerable communities. But I just wanted to sort of throw that in there.
Correct. Yeah, correct. There is this in our communities, and I think we have to bring the science to the table because these numbers aren't going down anytime soon. And I think that when we talk about research dollars and accountability and redistribution of funds, you know, I think it is important that individuals like Sarah, who are listening to those conversations, begin to understand that these are important issues that require representation, scientific research dollars to be appropriated towards those communities so that they can begin to elucidate those communities and represent as well. Because, you know, researchers need to understand how those communities are impacted so that they can serve them better.
Thank you both. You know, it just makes me think about one of the other topics we're talking about. All of you are, and most of us here probably were the only one in many, many rooms. And I know we've had conversations about burnout, or, you know, how do we make this more of a group effort so that there's strength in numbers and that we're helping one another to get to where we collectively want to be as a society. So, you know, I reflect about the time that I grew up and the freedoms I had, the racism I encountered, and where we are today. And I never imagined it would be worse for all of us and for the next generation that's going to follow us. So I think for me, the message is so important that whether you're going to be in law, whether you're going to be in government, whether you're going to be, you know, in medicine, wherever you're going to be an engineer, take others with you and take them now, you know, especially when you're young. This can have a big impact in all our communities. Debbie shared with us in our last call, she was taking youth, you know, into politics collectively. And I think this is something that we can encourage and educate, you know, next generation early on. So when they're studying, when they're getting their college degree, they can attach a deeper purpose in what it is that they're doing.
Thanks, Dee. I'll just chime in real quick, Winfrey. Sorry.
I was gonna sponsor you.
Thank you, Carol and Anita, for, you know, the accountability part. I'll just answer the second part so we have time for more questions. But yeah, thank you for that question. And I think you're right. Like, it's always better for the money to be spent than to go to waste. But I think ideally what would be happening is that when you look at a budget, very little money in the grand scheme of things goes to the things we're talking about. So for example, minority business development or mental health or cancer research, you know, very little money in the grand scheme of things goes to these things. And so ideally what would be happening is that, you know, the money that is dispensed to such programs, such agencies would be distributed in its entirety. That would be the ideal outcome, because there is a demand for it, there's a need for it. And at the end of the day, it's not, you know, it's obviously significant, like we want that money, but it's not, compared to other parts of the budget, it's not as sizable. And so ideally it would all be distributed. And so when the money, the bigger question, rather than the funds being redirected, which is important when you're looking at where is it being directed to? Where is it coming from? But say they're for two similar causes, rather than the redirection, I think the more important concern is why isn't that money being dispensed? Because it is needed. So redirection is relevant and, but sometimes it's not the most important question. So it just depends on the situation. I hope that answers your question.
I also want to chime in or to tag along that, there are a lot of special interests backing a lot of the propositions and the policies, even throughout California. So sometimes I wonder, why would this, and I'll just take an example, why would this tech company fund education through the government versus giving that same amount straight to the institutions? I questioned all those things because our world was also a lot less complicated before we had news being followed in so many different channels. So you have multi-generations, and within that, we have multi-channels of news that everyone follows. And then compiled with that, if you follow certain news, certain algorithms are also going to program you to keep following certain news. And you really kind of have to step back, I think, and look at both sides to really understand and have that critical thinking to understand what is the truth and where is the truth. So some things I've done is just watch a whole lot of documentaries. And then I look at who those people are in those documentaries and what their backgrounds are and what their message is. I also talk a whole lot with the community across diverse stakeholders as far as if you are in government, who do you know, who is actually active and doing things within our local government so that you can have a deeper idea of when you get that election ballot, you only know a few names, who is everybody else? I also think the ability to question, is also important. So we have mayors in LA that are running, we have a series of debates, but where are the governor debates? Why isn't that happening? So to your point earlier, Sarah, the system is also designed to create certain barriers, but I think us as stakeholders, we really need to know, at this point, what's happening, because my concern is that these things will continue to happen and we're not going to disrupt the system.
Yeah, and I'll make a quick note. So Dee, Rebecca, and I met at a roundtable that National ACE was having in Irvine. And I think one of my favorite moments from this roundtable was we had the mayor of Irvine there, Mayor Farah Khan, and we had a small business owner who directly asked the mayor why licensing permits were so inaccessible. And he was like, I just need to do some renovations, but I'm not able to do the renovations because the permitting process is so confusing. And then the mayor was like, okay, I'll take this back to the office. And that was the interaction. And I think that, I don't know what came of it exactly. I don't know, what the mayor's office did, but one thing is that national politics are obviously very important and definitely an arena for change, but local politics, I think, is really where the meat of it is. And I think if you're ever confused about what's happening at the national level, or if you're concerned about a certain issue, I think it's a lot harder for your mayor or your local representative to look at you and divert your question. You know what I mean? I think it's a lot easier for a senator or a president to do that. So I think really take advantage of your local politicians and your local offices, representative offices, government offices that you have, because it just, in my experience, I've noticed that that's where a lot of the really meaningful, transformative conversations happen because of the nature of national politics. Because you're taking everything that's gathered. And I know we were all, Rebecca, you and I, and Dee, we were talking about this. The nature of national politics is you're, synthesizing everything that you learn from all these diverse places and diverse communities facing different, contexts and situations, the national dialogue sometimes gets it becomes a little generic, or it becomes a little diluted, and then but I feel like at the grassroots level, at the local level, at the city county level, that's where, you're allowed to be a lot more bold. You're allowed to stand up to your representatives much more, you can expect a bit more of a transparent answer from them. Not always the case, but I think it happens a lot of the time. And so I think if you want a place to start, local government is a great place to start. And you can even go to them with state or federal questions, and they might not be able to answer right away, but you're still there. And even if you're making them a little uncomfortable, you're doing your thing,
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Sarah. And I'm really thinking back to Carol's original question too. How do we hold politicians accountable? How do we hold policymakers accountable, right? Folks who have the power. And I'm also really thinking about how the system, like Sarah, you had shared, and Anita, you spoke to, the system isn't designed for these particular communities. When we talk about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Desi American communities, that's inclusive of such a diverse group. And a lot of representation doesn't exist, especially at the local level. So oftentimes I think about my parents, who are political refugees to the United States, did not graduate high school, and get a mail ballot for the local election in the mail. And then are like, what is this? I don't know what this is. I don't even know what this is about. Okay, should we just check off Democrat because that's who we generally seem to associate with? So I keep going back to and thinking about what Rebecca had also said, who's not at the table. And I think back to my community, the immigrants who don't oftentimes even get the opportunity to get a seat at the table with the local politics, with the local politicians, with people who are stakeholders who will make the change. So I guess my question to the audience, to our panelists, is how do we reach those who don't have a seat at the table? How do we translate all of this policy, all of these laws, all of these local politics to every single person who's actually going to be impacted, and those who often are not thought about, who are not part of special interest groups, but are going to be impacted, who are living below the poverty line, who are the working class, who are going to be impacted the most. So how do we reach those folks, especially when we're talking about the diverse Asian American community?
I just saw Allison Polhill show up. And Allison, I don't know if you can hear us, but if you were able to catch Manpreet's question, I was just thinking you would be wonderful to share your opinion and your advice. And please also introduce yourself to our incredibly diverse community.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, I apologize for being late. I had a conflict that I could not get out of, so I do apologize. I'm Allison Holdorf-Paulhill, and I'm running for Council District 11 for City Council. And we are 18 days away from June 7th, so it's very, very exciting. And if you don't mind repeating that question, because I literally heard the very last part of it, I would greatly appreciate that.
Thank you for being here, Allison. And my question was about reaching the communities for especially local elections.
Yes.
That oftentimes are the ones who are hard to reach. So I gave the example of my parents who are immigrants to this country, English is their second language, and who didn't graduate high school, and oftentimes will see a local ballot and say, I have no idea what any of these names mean. So how do we translate our platforms that I think are understandable to a lot of folks here to those communities who are going to be impacted the most?
Such a great question. And I can tell you firsthand, so Council District 11 runs from LAX and Westchester all the way up to the Palisades and Brentwood, everything west of the 405, with the exception of Culver City and Santa Monica. And one thing that's happened in this race, there's 8 people running, is that all of the neighborhood councils have had meet the candidate forums, and some of the chambers of commerce and other local papers. And I have to say that that is one way that the community can get involved, and they've all offered questions to the candidates. So that is a way that anyone in your community can understand what's happening at a local level. And then one of the things that I think is critical for anyone that is in whatever council district you're in, when you're looking at a candidate, to verify that you're able to contact candidates individually and that they are responsive. And in my prior job, I'll just tell you, I worked as the chief advisor and district director to the Los Angeles school vice president, okay, of the board. And one of my responsibilities was to oversee 150 schools, which you can imagine. I mean, there's so many people that have just given up on LA Unified. They call, they have a problem with their school and they don't get answers. And we made it a priority to respond within 24 to 48 hours. And you can imagine during the pandemic, you would get the all caps emails, you would get profane, voicemails about, from parents legitimately concerned. And we made it a policy to respond. And I'll tell you, when you do, and when you have people responding in the language of whoever's calling, it makes a huge, huge difference, because one, you can understand what's happening at the ground level. And two, you can get people together so they feel heard. And finally, three, you can solve their problems. So does that answer your question? Or were you going for a different bent in terms of, I think you're talking about constituents feeling that they can access candidates. Is that right?
That was part of it, definitely.
Okay.
And I think we were talking about in the context of such a diverse, when we think about Asian American community,
Yes.
it's made up of such a diverse community that oftentimes we can't just lump people together, and there's so many
Absolutely.
diversities that are involved. So thank you for
Yes.
answering that.
You're welcome. And I think something to look for would be folks who are able to access different sectors of the population in their native tongue. I mean, that would be it. That is something to look for as well.
Yeah, and I think I'll jump in here and connect some dots. Thank you, Allison, and thank you for being
You're
here.
welcome.
Sarah brought up, that point that we witnessed at in Irvine at the National ACE event, where someone brought up their issues with unclear policy, but also they brought up, or maybe it was another person brought up the language barriers as well, and that how some people were being scammed because they didn't understand their rights within when hiring contractors and everything in the details beyond the permitting. And the mayor immediately responded right to that part too, to looking at the language. And so I appreciate Allison bringing up the neighborhood councils. I think touching, connecting to Manfred's point, I've just been encouraging some folks that I know who are unhoused or who have lived experience of being unhoused, join the neighborhood councils, or because as you mentioned, Allison, there's the squeaky wheel is what gets the attention, and that can actually unfortunately negatively impact people who were sort of waiting to get services. And so I've had a direct relationship with that, where we've tried to work with a neighborhood council, for example, in the Mar Vista area in Los Angeles, or in the Culver City area, I guess it is, where you have unhoused people and the neighbors are upset. They don't want to see them there. The unhoused people don't want to be there. And at the same time, the services aren't available. Like, there's case managers with 500 people on their caseload. I used to be a case manager. That's not tenable. And so when we're talking about the services and the funding and all of that, when we have that gap where a disconnect, where there's not enough throughput, there's not enough ability to help the people falling into homelessness move through the programs, to make space for all the people, because for the same number of people that you can house, those new people are now on the streets, and that's a reality of Los Angeles. So there was a question on the chat that came to me privately, which was, is the homeless issue a local issue? The homeless community is pretty large in my city, but I don't know who is responsible for helping them. Is it the city, county, or state? I'm not sure where the funding comes from. So is there someone on the panel who can speak to that? And if not, I can help. But I was curious first, if anyone in this group feels like they can speak to that, I'd be happy to open it up.
This is Debbie. Hi.
Hi, Debbie.
So one of the things that is a big frustration here in Sacramento County is that the state allocates money to the counties because the counties provide social services. And so whenever the state allocates money for social services, it goes directly to the county, and then the county is supposed to disperse it to the cities within the county. And that's where the rub comes here, at least here in Sacramento. That's where this bottleneck within the county as to how they allocate money, because Medi-Cal, for the homeless, it's, housing, all of that comes from the state to the county, and it doesn't always make all the cities, or make some cities and not other cities. And it's really kind of it's very frustrating. Very little money comes directly to the city. The city may tax itself to do things to help with their homeless situation. And I know Sacramento has done that. We've had some ballot measures, but the bulk of the money, and I mean, it's quite a bit, goes to the counties. And it's trying to get it out of the counties. And that's where the activism in terms of being active with the board of supervisors, that's where you can affect how the money comes to your county in order to work with the homeless. So, but they're trying to do workarounds. I know Sacramento is, because we have a pretty serious homeless population, and it's our mayor is very active in seeking out that money and sort of banging his hand on the desk and telling the county to give it up. So it's interesting. It doesn't always, like you said, it doesn't always get dispensed. They'll have the money, because sometimes they'll have the money. It's just, for whatever reason, the county itself and who's on the county's board of supervisors as to how the money gets dispersed, who has more power within that organization. So, but in California anyway, that's supposed to be how it's worked out. But as you can see, it's not totally effective.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Debbie.
I just wanted to chime in on that, because as taxpayers, a lot of us voted for HHH, and that was to give a lot of services to mental health and homeless. And there's 30 million that's sitting there right now. And I had heard, at least in LA, it was going between both the city and the county as far as, what was to be done with that money. So I know, Rebecca, you and I have talked about the stats of the homelessness. It's about 60 to 70,000 people. You have 30 million there on top of more money that's getting poured in. So I think for me, it goes back to the accountability and understanding how the system works, so that we can actively, push towards getting those monies into the hands of the most, the people who need it most. And what concerns me is when I talk to someone like Rebecca, who is literally on the front lines of doing this work, or another friend of mine who worked with HUD, I believe it's HUD, that basically dispenses the monetary funds. There's no money. Like there is no money that is getting to these people or to the homeless people. And so then, 30 million, you can build 30 million. And then, this is on top of billions, on top of another billion that's coming, not just for LA, but also for the Bay Area. So I think that is something that, needs collective attention. I also kind of wanted to ask on the educational front. Derek is my cousin. He is up in the Bay Area. Derek, I don't know if you can hear me. And Allison, I know you are highly involved in education as well. I know we have a lot of stakeholders here that are interested in what is happening in the public school system as far as having that diverse education trickle down into the textbooks. Feel free to just unmute yourself.
Hey, Delora, thanks for having me. And yes, I am Delora's Dee's cousin. That's actually new for me, so I'm gonna start calling you Dee now, Delora. What we're finding, I'm in the Bay Area, I'm in the East Bay. Delora and I are both from San Leandro, California, just south of Oakland in the Bay Area. And we're finding a lot of enrollment problems in public school systems. I think that's not too different from what's going on probably in LA in some cases. And I think that pattern is probably going towards the charter, the homeschool scenarios, and people recognizing that schools, kids are not being engaged. in appropriate manners. I know there's initiatives like project-based learning or work-based learning and things that actually are related to outside of school that kids need to be engaged with to be engaged. But there's a pretty large dynamic going on with public schools, especially with the advent of the use of Zoom and the disengagement and the desocialization from the last 2 years. All of it has kind of made a confluence of dynamics of wanting to be involved with public schools. And that's a bit scary, right? For a lot of people, I think, who here are parents and are part of families, but also for the school administrators themselves, because that's a big change, right? If we are going to start to look at public schools as a issue for engagement and how that moves forward. But on the optimistic side, I think it's a great opportunity to start looking at the reality of what is occurring in public school systems, with internet being the housing of knowledge, distance learning and hybrid learning being a mode of a mechanism for learning. But I think also we have to go back to the state of California, for the woman that's over at Sacramento County, and start to look at how we can reconfigure schools to be perhaps even more like community schools, or schools that represent not just education of K-12 learners per se, but schools as community hubs that are useful for not just the individual student or young citizen or resident, but frankly for their entire family, right? And the needs of the community in general. So that's my own interpretation of what is going on locally here in public schools in the Bay Area, at least, and probably all of California. And we work with, we have a program where students build projects for companies and win internships. So we're in the work-based learning space. We have about 5,000 students who are in our program across probably about 80, 90 schools. So this is what we're learning as we talk to teachers and look at their morale and so forth. So thanks for letting me have a chance to speak, Dee. I'll see if anyone else has any items they want to talk about to add on to the public school stuff.
And I mean, I could chime in, having worked with LA Unified, the second largest district in the nation for the last 5 years. I oversaw 150 schools, and language immersion was one of my responsibilities with the board office. And I have to tell you, from an enrollment point of view, they have completely taken off at the district. In fact, that's how we're able to increase our enrollment right now. And what's brilliant about a lot of the 50-50 programs and some of the 90-10 is that we're actually bringing kids back into public school because they want the French immersion, they want the Mandarin immersion, the Spanish immersion, Korean, there's a variety of programs. The district itself, because it's so gigantic, has a human relations, diversity, and equity division that's focused on infusing that type of awareness within all of the schools.
Call MJ.
It's as good as the administrators and the teachers are at implementing, but I've personally seen, overseeing 150 schools, really vibrant efforts to ensure that we're celebrating diversity, that we're sensitive to it. I know, and I was a bit spoiled, I will say this, working with the district, because any type of community engagement, when pre-pandemic we were in person and then we went via Zoom, I could call our interpreters and get any language interpreted for any town hall, whether it was 1,200 or 300, whatever it was. And I think that type of, we're very fortunate, as you mentioned, Derek, that we have technology now where that can be done. And I hope that answers part of your question. And then on the piece of homelessness and funding, LA, I just want to point out, is very interesting. We have 15,000 homeless students, for example, in LA Unified. The county's responsible for mental health and the city's responsible for housing. So those HHH monies go into the city for housing, which is a piece of the puzzle. But of course, then you have mental health and the lack of patient beds. That's a piece of the puzzle for homelessness. that the county's working with. And not all cities are like that, by the way. Several cities have departments of health within them, and they work together. And so part of I think the challenge for Los Angeles in particular is holding hands with the county and the school district and making sure that everybody is going in the same exact direction. And that's difficult with publicly elected boards.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Allison and Derek. Sorry, Rebecca, if I can just make one quick connection. So for Shay and Nikki, who are on the call from UCLA Lab School, I gotta give a shout out to both of them for showing up, because there is a connection. There is a connection with a parent that Derek knows, who is the brother of one of our Lab School family alums. So, you know, we are close, even though we are apart, we are connected. And Shay and Nikki have been doing a whole lot as far as DEI for the African American community in terms of celebration, curriculum, you know, thought leadership. And so I think that could be an interesting space between Derek, Shay, Nikki, myself, and Allison at some point to really converse deeper on and see, like, share best practices, share learnings, and how we can take our communities from where they are today into a much more vibrant and active space. And I invite anyone else here or is going to be listening to this recording, because I know there's a lot of educators that are highly interested in impacting this space. So sorry, I just wanted to say that. Rebecca, you were going to say something?
No, Nikki or Shay, do you want to add anything right now? I think we need to create a whole other conversation as well, but I'd love to hear if there's anything you want to weigh in right now.
Nikki, do you want to go first?
Hi.
Can you guys
I thank you guys so much for having this conversation. I've learned a lot from all of you just kind of listening in. And, you know, I think as parents, we also have a unique perspective on just everything that's going on in all of our communities and how we're responding and how we're prepared to respond and how we expect our administrators and our policymakers to respond. So it's just enlightening to engage with people who are actively participating in this conversation and are taking it as seriously as we do when we feel like our children are being influenced by everything that we speak and what they see us model every day. So I just want to say thank you for allowing the space to be here.
Absolutely. I just share the same sentiment. I'm constantly trying to learn. I don't have a lot of, like, I guess, professional accolades, but life-wise, I feel that I've thrown myself into some situations before. But I'm really just thriving to try to make a better space for, like, the younger generation, particularly whenever you guys started the conversation out, you guys were saying for the AAIP and the Black community. Like I said, Dee and I, Nikki, all of our kids have been friends since they were 4. And I've learned so much. I've gone to a few AAI, Stop Asian Hate activities and, like, protests that were in K-Town, and I learned a lot there. I was shocked by some of the language, which I didn't understand, because, you know, when as a Black woman or as a Black person just in America, when you hear, like, okay, we're going to a protest and we're going to, like, all get together and we're going to talk about how we're going to cure this one particular, or we're going to bring awareness to this one situation. What I didn't think about was when I went to an AAIP with all of the different languages. Like, it threw me for a loop, because one person was speaking Korean, one was speaking Japanese, one was speaking Chinese. So I didn't know, like, I was like, okay, let's all get together. But that's one part that I was really, so I really try to bring that when I talk to other Black people, to make them understand, like, okay, guys, like, it's the same, because we're going on the same struggle, but it's a little bit different. But we got to get the language part under control before we go in, because we took a group of Black people and they were like, let's go. But then we realized later that the language is, that was really different. So this is where I am now. I'm just trying to, like, learn, like, for each, like, segment of how each culture different, even though it's all Asian. So I'm just here to, like, learn for the most part right now, and just so I can, like, help educate my daughter on how to be a better ally. So when you see something, say something.
Shay, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think you're kind of summarized all of these things we just talked about, where it's a lot of different issues that we covered. We started with Dr. Gupta talking about the opioid crisis and her experience there. We've also mentioned the crimes that have been taking place on a national level, the policy levels. We've gone to the education space. We've talked about how do we hold people accountable. We've brought in parent. Thank you for Nikki also bringing in the parent perspective. And there's so many different issues we covered. And even within that, we know that it's impacting the diverse Asian American community in such unique and different ways. And especially when we think about what Dr. Gupta had brought up earlier with the lack of research, especially that's where my hat comes in as a researcher, as an education researcher, where with the Asian American community, there's not only lack of representation, but there's also lack of research and recognition that there is such vast diversity within this community. So I want to just ask us for this next 10 minutes to think about all of the things we've heard from our panelists, from the audience members, about so many different issues, and a lot of them systemic issues that are going to require us to come together on impacting these issues across our different communities and across the different identities we hold. And I want to ask just audience members, everyone here, how can we all feel empowered to be part of the solution and to come together on these issues? How do you think we can come together on these issues and feel empowered personally to do something, to be part of the solution? And I'd love to hear thoughts from other folks on what you're thinking about how we come together and how we feel empowered to do something and be part of the solution.
I have a little bit of a solution. I can't remember the young lady's name who just said something about going to your local politicians. I'm all for going to the local politician, but from my experience in dealing with them, because I worked a lot in the sex trade, sex marketing that was here in Los Angeles. So it's going to take, as far as like from what I see, once we get to the bigger level, yeah, there may be help, but it's going to take regular people. It's just us. That's it. I mean, they'll hear you. They may listen to you. I don't know if they'll like understand and like really hear you whenever it's like such a great need, and especially if you see it impacting in your own circle in real time. But it really takes limited resources from what I see. Like it sometimes it doesn't take a lot of money. It's like the time and effort and energy to like put in, and it's just like us getting together and like figuring it out for our own self, because they've been in control for so long. And we're still here, like scratching our hair, trying to come up with the right solution. But I honestly think it literally, like, we have to get in a room, a group of us, and like, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is the action that we have to take, because it's going to get caught up in so much red tape or where the money is going to come from and who's going to get the recognition for what the work they did. I don't care about having a gold star or a check mark on my name by the end of it, when I just see so many people hurting, and it's affecting us on all levels, no matter what your socioeconomic status is or what your education or your ethnicity. But it just seems to be attacking Black and brown people the most. But if we don't come together between these three, like this fine line, like it will completely be lost, because they're going to get caught up in like the details, whenever we just have to come together and like do the work. And like it's the energy and the time, from what I see. Sometimes it's not all the way money, and I'm not saying that money won't help, but we have to get together and put aside all of our implicit biases and just have real conversations. And like, how can you help in this area? Okay, you guys know these people over here, let's get together and do it like that. Because I've sat down with plenty of politicians. I spoke to Caruso 2 weeks ago. I mean, about candid, like real life stuff. He had really good on a broad sense of what it is, but he has no idea because he's not living it. He's not seeing it. His circle doesn't look like my circle. My circle is the Rainbow Coalition over here, you know? So it's like, it's a little bit of everybody. So I honestly think that it will definitely take all of us getting together in a room and like saying, okay, this is whatever the subject is, this is exactly what the problem is. This is how we're going to start and who's going to start it. Like, and that's all I have.
Yeah, I agree with you, Shay. And I think what you're speaking to is like accountability, like all of us being active members of society, having conversations, talking about what our experience is. Because the more we talk about what our experience is and what our actual lived condition is, we can relate to it. You know, people are concerned about the homeless, but they're not unhoused themselves, and they don't really live the experience, and they don't really recognize it and the perils of it all the time. You know what I mean? And until it's really in their face, until it's really in their backyard, until it's really making them feel uncomfortable in their own home. So I think that that's a perfect example of what is your association, what is your connection to the struggle, to the issue, and not just, you know, how do we in effect become liaisons between community and policymakers? Because there was someone, I think, who you spoke about, who's on this panel, who's talking about their work and being that community person, talking to unhoused people. That's important. I mean, you have to have someone who can live in both worlds, right? So you can speak to who the policymakers are, you can write the letters, you can be in the rooms where the conversations are being had and laws are being passed, but you can also reach back into the communities and actually talk to individuals. We have to rehumanize what we're all living. It's not just about, you know, those people looking at us as voters. It's about them looking at us as active citizens who are engaged in these systems with them. And we have to be able to meet them where they are, and they have to be able to meet us where we are. So I think that's a really important thing. Everything is so highly politicized. For example, myself, I'm very torn right now between someone who seems like he has the capital and the space to create change, and someone who represents me and my community, who I'm very familiar with as a Black woman, who I'd love to champion on, right? It's a real debate.
Right, I'm right there with you.
It's a real question about who do you connect to? Because I might have all kinds of ideas about how one might be more effective than the other in various rooms I sit in, right? And how people will respond to them. So it's really nuanced, and that's really important what Shay pointed out about all of us just learning to understand each other's communities. I have a friend who's Asian, who's South Asian, and very much likes to point that out, you know, because it's like my experiences as an Indian woman is very different from someone you may know who's Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese or anything else, you know, so it is a very important and nuanced thing. And I think we have those subtleties as well in the Black community, which more often than not are class-based or economically, you know, grounded. They don't have, you know, people don't see us, and we try not to see each other in these ways that diminish who we are. But again, these are the conversations we need to have so we can have a collective understanding about who we are, how we represent ourselves when we're looking to make change in the world. So again, I think this is where you start, you know, really just don't worry about who you are, you know, don't worry about what your level of education is or anything. You see the problem, right? And we all have a voice about that. And that's what we do as parents. We do that. We like, oh, the school's not going to do it. Then we're going to form a group and we're going to do it. You know, we need to do the same thing that we do for our children. You know, that's why there's PTAs. That's why there's, you know, family student associations, because, you know, as a part of that community, you take it upon yourself to make it better, you know, for the children. So we have to do the same thing for ourselves.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, everybody. I'm seeing the time, and I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to everyone, our speakers, to all of you for being here, to Delora for coordinating all of this, to National ACE, to Santa Monica Chamber of Commerce and Brookline Taiwanese Chamber of Commerce, who all co-hosted this. But I want to also just close and say, like, what really stands out to me as you all are speaking is that call for personal responsibility, whatever that means for each of us in our own circles and our own experiences, and getting involved, right? So volunteering, like, you know, I can dig deeper and understand the lives of unhoused folks, even if I hadn't experienced it, but family members of mine have. But I can do this, you know, by volunteering at like you know, doing the food service at Salvation Army once a week, or an access center that's actually going on today, or, you know, there's easy ways for us to start to connect and rehumanize, as you spoke to. And there's this call to action of really looking at our personal connection to public schools and how we're supporting them. Are we keeping our resources with the public schools? If not, there may be real reasons why not, but what can we do to keep supporting and growing that? And I just want to give a shout out to the call for action, and the intergroup dialogue work that we do at UHRI. Janice is on the call, and she's still there, but we do action projects. So we have a free intergroup dialogue series. I hope you'll all join us. It's 10 sessions. We're going to start it again. We just wrapped up our spring series, and we'll do another one either in the summer and fall. So keep in touch with us, because we'll have that on our events page at UHRI. And we do action projects. We really have people come together and get in the room and talk about what we can be doing collectively. And so that call to action that Shay gave us, you know, that's what we want to do at UHRI. And so I just want to, again, thank you all for being here. I hope you'll come back next Friday, because next Friday we continue that conversation of what does it mean to take action? What does it mean? Why do we sometimes end up in bystander roles? How do we actually build alliances together? And we're going to dig deeper next week.
Rebecca,
So
if I could just say one thing too. One thing, a call of action is, I'm thinking of all of you, friends, community members, stakeholders, and doing a voting party even, and just sitting down and talking, like sharing our ballots with each other, sharing information together in a super safe space. And we could do it outside of this event. But I really do think that that will have a critical impact in the direction that we're going, as it impacts the systemic issues that we're facing.
So thank you, everybody. Join us next Friday, because that time we are going to just have a conversation and we want to hear from everybody. And like Rebecca said, we'll talk about the roles that we play and how do we get to that place that Shay was talking about. Like, it's grassroots organizing, it's putting it together, saying we bringing the people with lived experience at the table and having the conversations. I want to thank our panelists again so much. Dr. Anita Gupta, Sarah Haque, and Carol Chen, thank you so much for taking the time. And it's these amazing, you know, women in leadership spaces that we are learning from. And it's all of our community members, everyone here. So we'll keep the conversation going next time on Friday, same time, same link, same information. So please join us and we'll keep the conversation going. Appreciate you all so much, and keep the fight going, standing in solidarity.
Take care, everybody. I'm going to hold the space in case there's anyone who needs to chat for a second.